The boy came home from school hungry every day, but he avoided talking about it. His father decided to find out the truth and hid a small device in his backpack. Subscribe and comment where you watching us from. John had always been a meticulous and devoted father. He made sure that his son Kevin had everything he needed, especially when it came to food. Every morning before sending his son off to school, he carefully prepared a nutritious lunchbox. It was filled with sandwiches, fresh fruits, a small dessert, and a juice box, enough to keep a growing boy full and energetic throughout the school day. John prided himself on making sure his son never went hungry, knowing how important a proper meal was for a child's development. Yet something was wrong lately. John had noticed a peculiar pattern. Every evening when Kevin returned home from school, he would rush to the kitchen and eat as if he hadn't had a single bite all day. It wasn't just normal after-school hunger. This was different. Kevin devoured food with the kind of desperation that made John uneasy at first. John brushed it off as a phase. Perhaps his son was growing and needed more food. Maybe school activities were making him hungrier than usual. But after several days of watching his son return home starving, he couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, as Kevin sat at the table quickly eating a large serving of pasta, John finally voiced his concern. "Kevin, are you not eating your lunch at school?" he asked casually, not wanting to sound too interrogative. Kevin hesitated, his fork pausing midair for just a second, before he quickly resumed eating, saying, "Yeah, I eat." Not looking up, John narrowed his eyes. His son wasn't a good liar. That slight hesitation was all he needed to know that something was off. "But you come home like you haven't eaten all day," John continued, keeping his tone gentle. "Are you sure everything's okay?" Kevin nodded quickly. Too quickly. "Yeah, just I get hungry fast, I guess," he replied. Something in his voice wasn't right. It was as if he was trying to end the conversation as soon as possible. So John let the subject drop for the moment, but made a mental note to investigate further. The next morning, as he packed Kevin's lunchbox with the usual care, John decided to check something before handing it to his son. He made sure to take a mental snapshot of everything inside: 2 turkey sandwiches, an apple, a chocolate chip cookie, and a bottle of orange juice. He even marked the position of each item in his mind, making sure he'd recognize if anything was missing when his son returned home. Kevin took the lunchbox without any complaint and hurried out the door, waving a quick goodbye as he ran toward the school bus. That evening, John was ready. As soon as his son walked through the door, he watched closely. Sure enough, Kevin made a direct beeline for the kitchen, opening the fridge before even greeting his father properly. "Hey, buddy," John called in a light voice. "How was school?" Kevin answered with a non-committal "fine" as he pulled out some leftover chicken from the fridge and started eating. John waited a few moments before casually reaching for his son's backpack, saying, "Forgot to check your lunchbox today," as he unzipped the bag. Kevin turned abruptly. "Dad, you don't have to," but it was too late. John had already opened the container. It was empty, completely empty, but something was wrong. There were no crumbs, no leftover apple core, no trace that the food had been eaten. It was as if the lunchbox had never been touched. John looked at his son. "You ate all of this?" Kevin swallowed hard. "Yeah." John wasn't buying it. His son had always been a slow eater, and there was no way he could have finished 2 sandwiches, an apple, and a cookie without leaving a single trace. Yet here was the evidence. An empty lunchbox that shouldn't have been empty. The unease in John's chest deep happened. Something was definitely wrong. He decided not to push Kevin further, at least not yet. If his son wasn't ready to talk, pressuring him wouldn't help. Instead, John would have to find out the truth himself. That night, as Kevin went to bed, John sat in the kitchen staring at the lunchbox on the counter. His mind raced through possibilities. Was his son giving his food away, losing it, throwing it out, or was someone taking it from him? The thought made John's jaw tighten. If someone was taking his son's food, that meant Kevin was afraid to talk about it, and that fear meant it wasn't just some innocent mistake. It was something serious. John didn't know what the answer was yet, but he was going to find out. John knew that whatever was happening with Kevin's lunch wasn't normal. His son wasn't just skipping meals. His food was disappearing completely. The most logical step was to start looking for answers at school. John decided to approach the situation calmly. If something serious was going on, He didn't want to scare Kevin into silence. Children often hesitated to share problems, especially if they involved fear or intimidation. John had no idea if his son was being bullied, pressured, or if there was another explanation entirely. But one thing was certain: Kevin wasn't eating his lunch, and he wasn't talking about it. The next morning, as Kevin got ready for school, John paid close attention to his behavior. His son seemed distant, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by quiet tenseness. "Have a good day, buddy," John said as he handed his backpack. Kevin nodded, but didn't make eye contact. "Thanks, Dad." John watched him walk out of the door and head toward the bus stop. He stood there for a moment, debating whether to drive straight to the school or wait until later in the day. Eventually, he decided to call the office and schedule a meeting with the principal later that morning. John arrived at Kevin's school, where the hallways were filled with the sounds of chattering students, lockers slamming, and teachers directing kids to their classrooms. The environment was the same as it had always been: structured, safe, and familiar, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The principal, Mr. Johnson, greeted him with a firm handshake. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a calm, professional demeanor. "John, good to see you. What can I do for you?" Mr. Johnson asked. John got straight to the point. "It's about my son, Kevin. I've noticed that he comes home extremely hungry every day, even though I pack him a full lunch. He refuses to tell me what's happening, and frankly, I'm worried." Mr. Johnson nodded, his expression turning serious. "That is concerning. Have you noticed any other changes in his behavior?" John sighed. "Yeah, he's more withdrawn. He avoids talking about school, and whenever I ask about his lunch, he gets nervous." The principal leaned back in his chair, considering the information. "We haven't received any reports about Kevin being bullied, but that doesn't mean something isn't going on. Let me check with his teacher and see if she's noticed anything unusual." John appreciated the effort, but he still felt uneasy. "Can we also check with some of the kids in his class? Maybe they've seen something?" Mr. Johnson agreed and called in Kevin's homeroom teacher, Mrs. Davis, a kind woman who had been teaching at the school for over a decade. Mrs. Davis arrived a few minutes later, looking mildly surprised by the meeting. "Kevin is a wonderful student," she assured John. "I haven't noticed anything wrong, but now that you mention it, he does seem quieter than usual lately." John nodded. "I just want to make sure nothing is happening that he's afraid to talk about." They decided to pull aside a few of Kevin's closest classmates and ask them simple, non-threatening questions. A group of 3 students was brought in 2 boys and 1 girl, all of whom had been friends with Kevin for some time. "Hey guys," Mr. Johnson said in a friendly tone, "we just wanted to ask you a quick question about your classmate, Kevin. Have you noticed anything strange about him lately?" The kids exchanged glances before one of the boys spoke up. "Kevin doesn't bring lunch to school." John stiffened. "What do you mean?" "I pack him lunch every morning." The girl shrugged. "I don't know. I just know that he never eats with us. He either says he's not hungry or just walks away when we sit down." John felt his pulse quicken. If Kevin never had a lunch at school, then where was it going? "Are you sure you've never seen him with his lunchbox?" he pressed. The second boy hesitated before saying, "Well, I think I saw him throw something away once, but I didn't really pay attention." John exchanged a glance with the principal. Something wasn't right. Kevin wasn't just missing his lunch, he was actively hiding the fact that he had one. After the students left, John ran a hand through his hair, trying to piece things together. "This doesn't make sense. I know for a fact that I put his lunchbox in his bag every morning. If he's not eating it, and if he's not with it, then where is it going?" Mrs. Davis frowned. "It's possible that he's given it away, or that someone is taking it." That idea made John's stomach turn. If someone is taking it, why wouldn't he tell me? The principal exhaled slowly. It could be a number of reasons. Maybe he's being pressured, or maybe he's ashamed to admit it. John's frustration mounted. He didn't want to assume the worst, but the facts were undeniable. His son was losing his food every day, and no one seemed to know why. At that moment, Mrs. Davis hesitated before speaking again. "There's one more thing. I don't want to make accusations, but Kevin does act nervous around one of the teachers." John's attention sharpened. "Which teacher?" Mrs. Davis bit her lip before replying. "Mr. Anderson, the new math teacher." John felt his jaw tighten. "What about him?" he asked. "I can't say for sure," she admitted, But I've noticed that Kevin seems more reserved in his class and Mr. Anderson. Well, he has a different way of handling students. Some of them seem uncomfortable around him. John clenched his fists. His first instinct was to storm into Mr. Anderson's classroom and demand answers, but he forced himself to stay calm. Jumping to conclusions wouldn't help Kevin. Instead, he looked at the principal. "I want to talk to this teacher today." Mr. Johnson nodded. "I understand your concern, John. I'll arrange for you to meet with him privately." As John left the office, his mind raced with possibilities. If a teacher was involved in whatever was happening to Kevin, this was far worse than he had imagined. He was no longer just dealing with a case of missing lunches. He was dealing with someone who had power over his son. John had no intention of letting this go. He was going to get to the bottom of it one way or another. John left the principal's office with a storm of emotions brewing inside him. The information he had just received disturbed him deeply. Kevin wasn't just skipping lunch. His food was disappearing entirely, and he was acting nervous around his math teacher, Mr. Anderson. The implications were too unsettling to ignore. If a teacher was involved, this situation was far more serious than he had initially thought. He couldn't allow himself to make assumptions, but everything pointed to something wrong happening between Mr. Anderson and his son. He needed to find out what it was. As he walked through the halls of the school, students rushed past him, chatting and laughing, unaware of the growing tension in his mind. To them, this was just another day, but to John, this was the beginning of an investigation he never wanted to be a part of. He reached the empath department and stood outside Mr. Anderson's classroom. The door was slightly open, and inside he could hear the teacher giving instructions to the students. John decided to wait until the lesson was over. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, his mind racing as he replayed every conversation he had with Kevin over the past few weeks, searching for any sign he had missed, any clue that could have told him what was going on. His son had been distant, reserved, unwilling to talk about school. Had he been trying to tell John something all along without actually saying the words? John felt the surge of frustration at himself for not noticing sooner. The bell rang, and students began filing out of the classroom, laughing and chatting as they made their way to their next class. Some of them glanced at John curiously as they passed, but he ignored them, keeping his eyes on the door and waiting for Mr. Anderson to emerge. When a man finally stepped out, John studied him closely. Mr. Anderson was in his late 30s, tall and lean with neatly combed blonde hair and a clean-shaven face. His expression was neutral, almost friendly, but there was something about his demeanor that immediately put John on edge. Maybe it was the way his eyes flickered with brief surprise at the sight of him or the slight hesitation in his step before he regained composure. "Mr. Anderson," the teacher said smoothly, "I wasn't expecting you today. How can I help you?" John forced a polite smile. "I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes." Mr. Anderson glanced at the time on his watch and nodded. "Of course, let's step inside my classroom." John followed him into the empty room. Desks were arranged in neat rows, and a few math problems were still written on the board. Mr. Anderson gestured toward a chair. "Please have a seat." John remained standing. "I'd rather stand." Mr. Anderson gave a small chuckle. "Fair enough. What's on your mind?" John didn't waste time. "It's about my son, Kevin. He comes home hungry every day, even though I pack him a full lunch. I spoke to his classmates, and they told me they never see him eat. When I asked him about it, he got nervous and refused to explain." Mr. Anderson tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And you believe this has something to do with me?" John studied his face. There was no immediate reaction of guilt, no flicker of panic, if anything. The teacher looked mildly amused, which made John even more suspicious. An innocent person would have been more confused, more eager to help figure out what was going on. "I don't know," John admitted, "but his homeroom teacher mentioned that he seems particularly anxious around you." Something shifted in Mr. Anderson's demeanor. Though it was subtle, he clasped his hands together in front of him, nodding slightly as if considering his words carefully. "I'm sorry to hear that. I do my best to make my classroom a comfortable space for all my students." John didn't like the way he worded that. It was too careful, too rehearsed. He decided to push a little further. "So you haven't noticed anything unusual about Kevin? Nothing at all?" Mr. Anderson smiled slightly. Not that I can recall. He's a quiet student, very polite. He does his work and doesn't cause trouble. If he's been acting anxious, I can't say I've noticed. John clenched his jaw, listening to the way Mr. Anderson spoke, and kept his tone calm and unbothered. It was as if he was trying too hard to appear innocent. John wasn't buying it. He didn't have proof yet, but his gut told him that this man was involved. After a brief silence, John said, "Well, I appreciate your time. If you do notice anything, I hope you'll let me know." Mr. Anderson nodded. "Of course, Mr. Anderson. I want all my students to feel safe and comfortable in my classroom." John gave a tight nod and turned to leave. As he stepped into the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Anderson had just lied to his face. The teacher had been too composed, too smooth in his responses. Most teachers would at least express concern when hearing that a student was struggling, but Mr. Anderson had done none of that. He had simply deflected as if he had already prepared his answers in advance. John knew he needed to tread carefully. If Mr. Anderson was taking advantage of his authority over Kevin, confronting him directly wouldn't be enough. He needed evidence. He needed proof. He decided to return to the principal's office. This time, he wasn't going to just voice his concerns. He was going to demand answers. John walked back toward the principal's office, his mind racing with thoughts. His conversation with Mr. Anderson had done nothing to ease his concerns. If anything, it had only made him more suspicious. The teacher had been too composed, too calculated. There was no genuine concern in his voice, no real curiosity about Kevin's situation. It was as if he had already anticipated the questions and had his answers ready, and that was not the reaction of an innocent man. As John entered the principal's office, Mr. Johnson looked up from his desk, surprised to see him again so soon, and gestured for John to sit. But John remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. The principal exhaled slowly, closing the folder he had been reviewing. "John, I take it your meeting with Mr. Anderson didn't go as you'd hoped." John shook his head, frustration evident in his expression. "No, it didn't." He was too smooth, too careful with his words. He didn't even seem remotely concerned when I told him about Kevin's missing lunches. If he were innocent, wouldn't he have at least acted surprised? Mr. Johnson rubbed his chin, considering John's words carefully. "I understand your frustration, but we can't jump to conclusions without evidence. Teachers are used to dealing with difficult situations, and some of them develop a professional detachment. It doesn't necessarily mean he's hiding something." John leaned forward, his voice firm. "Then explain this to me. Kevin never eats at school. His classmates say they've never seen him with a lunchbox. He refuses to talk about it. He gets nervous when I ask questions. His homeroom teacher told me that he seems anxious around Mr. Anderson. And when I confronted Anderson, he gave me nothing but rehearsed answers. How much more do I need before someone takes this seriously?" The principal sighed and folded his hands together on the desk. "I believe that you're genuinely concerned, and I want to help, but I have to work within the rules. Without proof that Mr. Anderson is doing something wrong, I can't take disciplinary action against him. The school has strict protocols for handling accusations against staff members." John clenched his jaw, barely restraining his frustration. "So what are you saying? That you're just going to let this continue? That my son is going to keep losing his lunch, keep coming home hungry, and you're going to do nothing?" Mr. Johnson hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm saying that you need to be careful. If Mr. Anderson really is doing something inappropriate, we need to handle it the right way. Otherwise, he'll just deny everything and nothing will change." John exhaled sharply. He wanted to argue, to demand immediate action, but he knew it would get him nowhere. The principal had already made his position clear unless John could provide solid evidence. The school's hands were tied. Feeling defeated, but more determined than ever, he turned toward the door before leaving. He looked back at Mr. Johnson. "If you won't do anything, I will." The principal sighed. "John, I understand you're upset, but please don't do anything rash." John did not answer. He simply walked out of the office, his mind already forming a plan. If the school wouldn't take action, then he would find another way. He wasn't going to sit back and watch his son suffer in silence. As he drove home, his frustration slowly turned into resolve, and he replayed everything in his mind, searching for a way to get the answers he needed. The school might have been powerless, but wasn't he? He had one advantage they didn't. He could act without restrictions. That night, after Kevin went to bed, John sat alone in the kitchen deep in thought. He needed a way to uncover the truth without alarming his son or tipping off Mr. Anderson. Confrontation hadn't worked. The principal wouldn't intervene. His only option was to gather undeniable proof. He picked up his phone and began researching ways to discreetly monitor interactions. It didn't take long for him to land on an idea. The next morning, before sending Kevin to school, he would place a recording device inside his son's backpack. If someone was taking his food, the audio would capture it. If Mr. Anderson was involved, there would finally be proof. John knew it was a risk, but at this point he had no choice. His son needed him, and he wasn't going to fail him. John woke up before dawn, his mind already set on the plan. The frustration from his conversation with the principal had not faded overnight. In fact, it had fueled his determination. He spent hours researching and planning, making sure that whatever he did next would yield concrete answers. The school had refused to act without proof, so he would get proof himself. He moved carefully through the quiet house, not wanting to wake Kevin just yet. The small recording device sat on the kitchen table, barely the size of a thumb drive. A simple tool, discreet enough to go unnoticed inside a backpack. John had tested it the night before, making sure the audio was clear, confirming that it had enough battery to last through the school day and could pick up voices from several feet away. It wasn't much, but it was the best option he had. When Kevin finally came downstairs, rubbing his eyes sleepily, John greeted him with a warm smile, trying to keep things normal. He didn't want his son to suspect anything. As usual, he packed his lunch, making sure everything was neatly placed inside the container. But before zipping up the backpack, he carefully tucked the recording device into the front pocket, ensuring it wouldn't be easily noticed. "I'll see you after school, Dad," Kevin said as he grabbed his bag and slung it over his shoulder. John ruffled his son's hair and watched him walk out the door, his heart pounding. Now all he could do was wait. The day passed agonizingly slow at work. John found himself unable to concentrate, kept glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until Kevin would return home. His hands itched to grab his phone and call the school, but he forced himself to stay patient. If he acted too soon, he might ruin everything. He needed a full day's worth of recording, enough to capture whatever was happening without raising any suspicions. When it was finally time, he left work early and drove straight home, arriving just minutes before Kevin's bus pulled up. He watched from the window as his son stepped off, his face unreadable. As soon as Kevin walked through the door, John greeted him casually. "Hey, buddy, how was school?" Kevin shrugged, same as always. John studied him for any sign of discomfort, any change in demeanor, but his son seemed as normal as ever. It was both reassuring and frustrating. If something was happening, Kevin had gotten good at hiding it. John waited until his son went upstairs before reaching for the backpack. His hands were steady as he unzipped the front pocket and pulled out the recording device. He took it into his office, closed the door, and plugged it into his computer. The audio file loaded quickly, and as soon as he pressed play, he heard the faint sounds of children chatting and lockers slamming. The day had officially begun. He fast-forwarded through the morning chatter, listening for anything significant. At first there was nothing unusual, just the everyday noises of school life. Teachers giving instructions, students whispering, the occasional rustling of papers. Then, as lunchtime approached, he heard something that made his blood turn cold. The faint sound of Kevin unzipping his backpack. A brief pause, then another voice, one that did not belong to his son. "Give it to me." John froze. The voice was low, controlled. Not angry, not aggressive, but firm. There was no mistaking it. "Mr. Anderson." There was a hesitation, then the sound of something being pulled from a bag, a faint rustling from Kevin's lunchbox. A moment of silence followed before the voice spoke again. Quieter this time. "You know the rules." John clenched his fists, his pulse hammering in his ears. There was no doubt now. His son's teacher had been taking his food. But why? What rules was he talking about? Kevin's voice came next, barely above a whisper. Can I at least keep the apple?" There was another pause, then the sound of something being placed back into the bag. Eat it quickly and don't tell anyone. The recording continued, but John barely heard the rest. His mind was spinning, his body tense with anger. Mr. Anderson had been stealing his son's food. Not another student, not some misunderstanding. His teacher and Kevin had been too afraid to say anything. John had heard enough. He unplugged the device and sat back, gripping the edge of the desk to steady himself. This wasn't just about missing lunches anymore. This was manipulation, this was control, and now John had the proof he needed. He wasn't going to wait for the school to take action. He was going to put an end to this himself. John sat in silence, the audio recording still echoing in his mind. The steady, measured voice of Mr. Anderson. The way he spoke with complete authority, the way Kevin hesitated before handing over his lunch. It was all too much. His son had been suffering in silence, afraid to say a word, while this man had taken advantage of his vulnerability. John felt his hands tighten into fists as a wave of anger surged through him. For a long time, he simply stared at the computer screen, his mind racing. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it, with undeniable proof, made it all the more real. The fact that a grown man, a teacher, was taking food from a child in such a methodical way sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just bullying, it was something worse, something calculated. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't storm into the school just yet. He needed a plan. If he acted recklessly, he risked giving Mr. Anderson time to cover his tracks. John knew he had to approach this strategically, making sure that when he confronted the teacher, there would be no way for him to escape the consequences. He pressed play again, listening closely to the last part of the recording. Eat it quickly and don't tell anyone. That line haunted him. It meant that Mr. Anderson had done this before, likely many times. The casual way he spoke, the certainty in his voice. It was clear this wasn't new to him. John's stomach turned at the realization. How long had this been going on? Was Kevin the only victim? His first instinct was to march upstairs and demand the full story from his son. But he stopped himself. Kevin had been terrified enough to keep this a secret. If John approached him aggressively, he might shut down completely. He needed to be patient to let his son know he was safe before pressing for answers. Taking another deep breath and rubbing his temples, he finally stood up, grabbed the recording device, tucked it safely into his pocket, and walked toward the stairs. His footsteps felt heavy and his heart pounded as he reached Kevin's room. He knocked gently before pushing the door open. Kevin was lying on his bed, flipping through the pages of a comic book. When he looked up and saw his father standing there, his expression immediately shifted. There was something in his eyes, fear, hesitation. He knew something was wrong. Hey, buddy, John said softly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Can we talk for a minute? Kevin hesitated before nodding slowly. He sat up, closing the comic book and placing it on his lap. John sat on the edge of the bed, keeping his posture relaxed. He didn't want to scare his son, but he needed the truth. I know about the lunches, Kevin, he said gently. I know someone has been taking your food. At these words, Kevin's entire body tensed. His fingers gripped the edges of the book, his gaze dropping to the floor, and he didn't say anything. John continued, his voice steady. I need you to tell me the truth. Was it Mr. Anderson? A sharp intake of breath escaped Kevin as his shoulders hunched, and he squeezed his eyes shut for a moment before nodding. John swallowed hard. Even though he already knew the answer, hearing his son confirm it made it feel even worse. How long has this been happening? John asked carefully. Kevin bit his lip, hesitating a while, and admitted in a voice barely above a whisper, Did he ever threaten you? Kevin shook his head quickly. Not really. He just made it seem like I had to give it to him, like it was normal. He said it was a rule. I didn't want to get in trouble. John felt his chest tighten. This man had manipulated his son into believing that handing over his food was an obligation, something expected of him. And that was worse than outright threats. It was conditioning. Why didn't you tell me, buddy? John asked softly. Kevin hesitated again, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. I was scared. I thought maybe I did something wrong and I didn't want to make it worse. John exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm, and reached over, placing a comforting hand on Kevin's shoulder. Listen to me. You did nothing wrong. This is not your fault. And I promise you I'm going to fix it. You don't have to deal with this alone anymore. Kevin finally looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. But Dad, if you tell the school, what if he gets mad? John's grip on his shoulder tightened slightly, reassuring him, that's not going to happen. I won't let it. You're safe, Kevin. For a long moment, his son simply stared at him, searching his face for reassurance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. John knew that was the best he could hope for. In this moment, he ruffled his son's hair gently before standing up. I need to take care of something, but I want you to know that you don't have to worry about this anymore, okay? Kevin nodded again, though his expression was still uncertain. John watched as his son climbed on the bus and found a seat by the window. As the vehicle pulled away, Kevin glanced back at his father, and for the first time in weeks there was no fear in his eyes. John exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He knew this wasn't something that would disappear overnight. Kevin had spent weeks feeling powerless, and that kind of experience left scars. It was going to take time for him to trust that he was truly safe, but time was something they had. John returned inside and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the lunchbox he had packed earlier that morning. The simple act of making sure his son had food now carried a weight it never had before. He had always thought of providing meals as just another part of being a parent, but now he realized it was more than that. It was security, it was love, and it was something no one should ever be able to take away from a child. His phone buzzed with a message from the principal. John, just wanted to let you know that Mr. Anderson officially resigned this morning. He won't be coming back, and we're also implementing stricter teacher oversight to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. John let out a slow breath, reading the message twice before setting the phone down. It was over, really over. That night, as they sat at the dinner table, Kevin ate without hesitation for days. He had been pushing his food around his plate, eating just enough to avoid questions. But tonight was different. He ate like a kid who wasn't afraid of going hungry. The next day after dinner, John sat on the couch flipping through a book when he felt a small presence settle next to him. He glanced down to see Kevin leaning against his side. Hey, buddy, John said, closing the book. Everything okay? Kevin hesitated before nodding. Yeah, and after another pause, he looked up. Thanks, Dad. John smiled, wrapping an arm around his son's shoulders as outside the night stretched on peaceful and calm. It was a new day, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt right. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next video. Feel free to share this video with others and check out more stories on our channel.